Growing up in a small town in Vermont, everyone knew everyone's business. Our high school had maybe 180 students in my graduating class, which meant secrets had a shelf life of about 48 hours. But there was one thing that lingered for years without ever being properly addressed. Mr. Brennan, the history teacher we all called Creeper Brennan when adults weren't around. He'd been teaching at the school since before my parent graduated. By the time I walked through those doors as a freshman, the warnings had already been passed down like some dark tradition. Don't stay alone with him after class. Watch how he positions himself during tests. Notice who he calls on most often. At 14, I thought it was just the way teenagers mythologize the weird adults in their lives, turning quirks into horror stories for entertainment. I never had Mr. Brennan as a teacher, so my exposure to him was limited to passing him in hallways. He wore wrinkled khakis every day, spoke quietly, and had this perpetually distracted air about him, like he was always misplacing his keys or forgetting what he'd walked into a room for. If you strip away the rumors, he just seemed like another exhausted middle-aged teacher grinding to the same lesson plans he'd used for decades. But my best friend Melissa had him for world history sophomore year. She confirmed everything. The way he'd stand too close to certain girls during exams, hovering over their desks far longer than necessary. How he'd find excuses to keep specific students after class for extra help they never asked for. The strange habit of taking photos during class, claiming it was for the yearbook committee even though he wasn't on it. Each incident alone seemed borderline, something you couldn't quite report because it hadn't technically crossed a line. But when you added them all together, a pattern emerged that made your skin crawl. The administration never intervened, which made some of us wonder if maybe we were overreacting. Our principal was well respected, known for being protective of students. Surely if something serious was happening, she would have acted. Then senior year arrived, and I joined the debate team. Those long bus rides to tournaments across New England became confessional sessions. Stories about Mr. Brennan circulated constantly, especially after Ms. Hartley joined the staff. She was only 24, fresh out of grad school, and the proximity and age made us more comfortable sharing things we kept quiet about before. One teammate, Jordan, swore Mr. Brennan practically lived at the school. I laughed it off until another friend, Marcus, mentioned he'd arrived early for jazz band one morning and encountered Mr. Brennan stepping out of the boys' locker room in a bathrobe, hair dripping wet. He also used the radiators in his classroom to dry laundry. Maybe he wasn't technically residing there, but the boundaries between his professional and personal life had clearly dissolved. Another girl, Sarah, told us about her friend who'd been assigned attention in Mr. Brennan's classroom. The girl refused to serve alone and insisted someone stay with her. Smart choice, because while she was collecting papers from the floor, Mr. Brennan photographed her from behind. When confronted, he claimed it was a joke, but his face betrayed him. The worst story came from Kyle, who'd opened the wrong desk drawer while looking for tape. Inside were dozens of printed photographs. All girls, all students from our school, some from years ago, some recent. None of them knew they'd been photographed. That's when I stopped dismissing everything as teenage exaggeration. The teachers knew too. You could see it in their faces whenever his name came up in conversation. That mixture of frustration and helplessness. They knew something was deeply wrong, but proving it in a way that would satisfy the district and the union was another matter entirely. Then came the incident with Ms. Hartley. She'd bent down to retrieve something from her desk while her classroom door stood open. Mr. Brennan was in the hallway with a student, and she overheard him make an explicit sexual comment about her position. She didn't let it slide. She went directly to the administration and made it very public. For a brief moment, it felt like something might actually change. The other teachers seemed almost relieved that someone with authority was finally pushing back. But nothing happened. He kept his job. Everyone pretended everything was fine. I graduated a few months later and tried to put all behind me. 3 years passed before I returned to help coach the debate team. Same bus rides, same gossipy atmosphere, and that's when I learned he was finally gone. Coach Peterson told me the truth over coffee one afternoon. The administration had been building a file on Mr. Brennan for years. The problem was the teachers' union made it nearly impossible to terminate a tenured teacher without ironclad evidence. Mr. Brennan had an excuse for everything. He treated all students the same way, he claimed. Photos were for memory boards. Seating arrangements were randomized. After-school makeup exams were policy. There was never one definitive piece of evidence that crossed the legal line. But Coach Peterson also told me something that made my stomach turn. Most of the staff believed he'd done far worse than stare or take unauthorized photos. They just didn't know who his victims were. The final piece of the story explained everything. A few years after my class graduated, Mr. Brennan fixated on a 15-year-old girl in one of his classes. He somehow obtained her phone number and began calling and texting her relentlessly. It escalated to the point where he would park outside her house at night, sitting in his car and messaging her, trying to convince her to come outside. She finally told her mother, who worked the front desk at a dental office downtown. Her mother didn't have money for a lawyer, but she wanted him gone more than anything. She told her boss, Dr. Mitchell, one of the wealthiest people in our town. He immediately promised financial and social backing. He went to the school board himself and made it clear he would fund whatever investigation or legal process was necessary. That pressure finally pushed the administration into action. They confronted Mr. Brennan, and under threat of prosecution, he agreed to early retirement and left town. The victory fell hollow. He wasn't charged with anything, which meant he could teach again. Last anyone heard, he'd moved to Florida and gotten hired at another high school, probably terrorizing a whole new generation of students who didn't yet know to be afraid. Spring of my senior year, in 2017, our high school in Asheville, North Carolina, was hosting this massive send-off rally for the girls' basketball team. My friends and I had zero interest in attending. My final class was stage crew, something I'd only taken for the arts credit, and 2 juniors, Devin and Tyler, shared that period with me. We had a ritual of sneaking out to the same fast food place whenever we could manage it. Skipping the rally felt like a natural extension of that habit. The only obstacle was the security staff, who took particular joy in catching students attempting early exits. Instead of risking the front parking lot, we decided to cut through a nature trail that separated the school from the back lot. It was overgrown and rarely used, which made it perfect. We were halfway down the path when we encountered someone none of us recognized. He looked like he'd been rolling around in the underbrush for hours. Thin kid, maybe 16, shorter than me but taller than a typical freshman. His dark hair stuck out in every direction. His shirt was smeared with dirt, and his jeans looked like he'd been crawling through mud all day. My first irrational thought was that he'd been camping out there, which made no sense but somehow fit what I was seeing. He came straight toward us, breathing hard like he'd been running. Devin and Tyler greeted him like they vaguely knew him, later explaining he was in their grade, more of an acquaintance than a friend. He barely acknowledged their hello before demanding to know what we were doing out there. We told him we were avoiding the rally. Tyler joked about him camping in the woods, but the kid's expression didn't change. He finally explained he'd been dropped off that morning to catch the bus to the alternative campus, the place students went when they were suspended. The plain clothes made sense after that. He said he didn't want to go, so he'd hidden in the nature trail all day. The entire time he spoke, he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to emerge from the trees at any moment. I didn't understand what was happening, but I could feel Devin and Tyler stiffen beside me. We tried ending the conversation by mentioning we needed to reach our cars before the rally dismissed. The moment he heard the word cars, his entire demeanor shifted. He followed alongside us, suddenly friendlier, and asked if one of us could give him a ride home. We made excuses, but he pushed back, saying people would start looking for him soon, and he'd be in serious trouble when they did. We suggested he'd be safer staying hidden where he was. That's when he told us he'd broken into a vehicle at the large church behind the school. He lifted his shirt just enough for us to see the handgun tucked into his waistband. Everything in me went cold. I'd never seen a firearm up close before, but the gun wasn't what terrified me most. It was a combination of desperation, paranoia, and something else I couldn't quite identify in his eyes. Devin, barely above a whisper, suggested he ditch the weapon and leave the area entirely. The kid just stared at us. The silence stretched long enough that I felt each second drag. I told him we wouldn't tell anyone, and we really needed to leave. Then Tyler, usually the quietest among us, mentioned we shouldn't be anywhere near him if people came looking for stolen weapons. The kid locked his eyes on Tyler and asked again if someone would drive him home. This time it didn't sound like a question. For reasons I still can't explain, I told him no. The silence that followed made my skin crawl. Then he asked if we wanted to see something before we left. Devin shut that down immediately, telling him we had to go, and walked past him without waiting for a response. Tyler and I stayed close behind, picking up speed the moment we cleared him. After a few steps, we broke into a full sprint toward the parking lot. When I glanced back, he was still standing on the path, watching us. Then he stepped onto a smaller trail that led deeper into the woods. We reached the parking lot and found police cars everywhere. We stayed out of sight and circled around to another entrance, only to find it locked. An administrator eventually spotted us and brought us inside, where we finally learned the complete story. The kid hadn't just been hiding to skip alternative school. He'd stolen not only the handgun he'd shown us, but also a semi-automatic shotgun from a vehicle behind the church. Before that, he'd texted his girlfriend saying she should turn off the television once she saw his name on the news, and told her what he planned to do. She panicked and called police immediately. Between her call and the report from the church about the missing firearms, officers pieced it together and found in the woods shortly after we escaped. I think about that encounter more than I'd like to admit. What he planned to do with those weapons. What might have happened if we'd agreed to give him a ride. How close we came to being part of whatever he had planned instead of witnesses who got away. During my freshman year in Seattle, when I was around 14 and still trying to figure out how to exist in a crowded school without drawing unwanted attention, I developed this habit of drifting through each day in a quiet haze. I didn't really talk to people unless absolutely necessary. Most days I ate lunch alone or hid in the back of whatever classroom I could find. The only real break I had was public speaking class, not because I enjoyed it, but because the teacher was obsessed with the upcoming school musical and didn't bother assigning actual speeches. That meant I could sit next to a girl named Bryn and just talk until the bell rang. For the first few months, that class felt like the safest part of my day. No pressure, no eyes on me, until a folded piece of paper in the hallway changed everything. A girl from band walked up between classes, slipped a note into my hand, and said it was from Zachary. Like that name should have immediately meant something. I didn't want to look confused, so I thanked her and tucked it away until I got home, where I tried to remember any Zachary I knew. The only one who came to mind was this tall senior who sat behind me in public speaking. Someone I had never spoken to and honestly didn't think had ever noticed me. When I opened the paper, I knew instantly I wasn't dealing with something harmless. It was a messy handwritten poem describing things about me no stranger should know, including my full name spelled correctly, which even teachers sometimes struggled with. It was framed as some grand confession of love from a person I'd never exchanged a single word with. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was crushing anxiety, knowing I might have confronted someone I didn't know. So I just stopped going to that class altogether. I avoided it for weeks until Corey from band caught up with me one day and mentioned I'd been skipping. She joked about it at first, then added that my boyfriend seemed to think I was avoiding him. I tried telling her he wasn't my boyfriend, but she waved it off and said he talked about me constantly and that I should give him a chance. I didn't want to stand there arguing about someone I barely recognized, so I muttered something non-committal and left, hoping that would end it. Instead, things escalated. Another poem appeared on my locker. Then I started seeing him waiting outside my classes, standing in positions that made it difficult to slip past without acknowledging him. One afternoon, he stepped directly in front of me, holding a thick black binder. He told me he was a writer, and everything inside was written for me. Flipping through those pages felt like reading someone else's fantasy version of my life. Before I could figure out how to hand it back, he leaned in and kissed me, pressing me against the wall so firmly I couldn't move. When he finally stepped back, I told him I was late for class just to escape. I never told anyone about that moment, even when he kept showing up outside the building where my brother parked his car, or when I saw him wandering through my neighborhood like he was searching for something. Instead, I changed my routes to class, slipped through side doors, and convinced myself that graduation would solve everything since he was a senior. Then one night after the spring musical, when a few of us were heading out to get food, I was walking toward my friend's car when someone grabbed me around the waist. I turned and saw him, holding me against the side of a different vehicle, talking like we just bumped into each other on a normal afternoon. He kept saying love didn't work on a schedule, that he'd been thinking about me constantly. Then, without hesitation, he started talking about running away together. He didn't have a ring, he said, but that didn't matter because he wanted to marry me anyway. I froze, trying to smile in a way that wouldn't make things worse, until when my friends noticed what was happening and pulled me away with some excuse about her mom needing us home immediately. Even as she dragged me off, he called after me, asking if my answer was yes. I mumbled something just to escape. Once I was in the car, I stayed quiet until the shock wore off enough for everyone to laugh about it nervously. But after that night, every hallway walk and every trip to the parking lot became a carefully planned mission to avoid crossing paths with him again. Years later, when I was around 21, I was scrolling through social media when people I hadn't talked to since graduation suddenly started messaging me links to a news article. It turned out he'd been arrested on multiple charges involving minors, and some of the girls mentioned in the article were people I'd known. Seeing their names made everything from freshman year hit me all over again. I found myself terrified that any of his behavior toward them might have been connected to me in some way, that maybe I could have prevented something if I'd spoken up. He's in prison now, supposedly for a long time. Even though he's gone, there are still books floating around under his name, collections of poems dedicated to me that he somehow managed to publish years ago. I try not to think about that part too much. What matters is he isn't out there anymore, and he can't corner any other girl the way he cornered me. I was 16 when my school finally let me join the European tour, something they organized every year. For most of us, it felt like the biggest thing that could happen in high school. It was my first time on a plane, which meant it was also my first time leaving the United States. I remember stepping into Europe thinking everything was automatically safer and calmer than back home in Michigan. The trip was tightly scheduled, with teachers and even a few parents tagging along to supervise. But every day, we were given a couple of hours to wander around in small groups, as long as we stayed close to the hotel. My friend Jenna and I spent one of those afternoons walking around the streets near our hotel in Rome, just taking pictures and killing time until we had to meet everyone else for pizza at a little place around the corner. The teachers were seated inside near the doorway, so they could keep track of who was coming and going. The rest of us were scattered along the sidewalk, eating and talking. It all felt harmless and routine. Nothing about that setting suggested anything could go wrong. At some point, I decided to duck into the tiny shop next door for a bottle of water. It was so close, I didn't think to bring anyone with me. There were other students sitting almost right outside anyway. I paid, stepped out with a bottle in my hand, and before I even had time to register anything, a large man in a dark jacket pushed me up against a light pole. He leaned so close that his jacket blocked me from anyone passing by and asked for my name in this strange, forceful tone. I was so shocked I couldn't get anything out. He asked again, slower this time, like he expected me to cooperate. I refused, and the moment I shook my head, one of the girls from my group noticed what was happening and rushed over to yank me away from him. I started crying immediately. Our teachers came out to figure out what was going on. Our group leader assumed the man was drunk and yelled at him to leave. The guy backed off and walked around the corner. For a minute, we thought that was the end of it. About 10 minutes later, I was standing close to the door with several people between me and the edge of the sidewalk when the same man suddenly appeared again. He came from nowhere, tried pushing through the group in front of me, and reached out as if trying to grab me a second time. The reaction was immediate. Everyone jumped up. The teachers rushed outside, and the place went from relaxed to chaotic in seconds. The man backed away again, started running, and we watched him jump into a white car further down the street before speeding off. The adults gathered all of us quickly and walked us back to the hotel in a tight group. None of us understood what was happening, and the teacher seemed unsure whether this man had picked me randomly or had followed us from somewhere earlier in the day. Later that night, we had our usual free time to find dinner in smaller groups. We dressed up and wandered until we found a place that looked good. With everything else happening around us, the earlier incident faded into background, replaced by the excitement of being teenagers on a trip far from home. After dinner, our whole group minus the adults agreed to meet at a bar a few streets away. Some of the older students liked feeling rebellious, having 1 or 2 drinks before curfew, and the rest of us just went for the atmosphere. When I reached the entrance, 2 people from my tour grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. They told me to sit down immediately. Someone had spotted the same man from earlier sitting in the same white car, parked just a short distance up the road. He wasn't alone this time. There was another man with him. I completely broke down. Everyone was tense, trying to explain the situation to the staff while deciding what to do. We eventually gathered everyone and walked back to the hotel as one large group. constantly checking behind us and making sure nobody was missing. Thankfully, we were scheduled to leave Rome early the next morning. I still think about that night, wondering where he first saw me, how long he'd been following us, and what he wanted. At 16, I assumed Europe was safer than home and let my guard down in ways I normally wouldn't. Now, thinking back, I realize how quickly you can forget caution when you're excited and distracted, especially in a place that feels like a dream, until something snaps you back to reality. When I was around 6, my parents split up. Not long after that, my dad ended up with full custody. My mom was dealing with a lot back then, mostly drinking and a string of arrests. So it was just me, my little sister Harper, and my dad starting over in a neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon that he picked because the elementary school was close enough to walk to. He liked the idea of us being able to stroll through quiet streets when we got older. But at that time, we were way too young to be out on our own. Most days, he drove his old black sedan through the pickup lane. Every now and then, he'd walk up to the school gate to get us. The pickup system was straightforward. Teachers standing with their classes, assistants checking names, kids getting walked to the right car. Since my mom wasn't around then, my dad was the only person ever listed on our paperwork. We knew the drill. The staff knew the drill. Nothing unusual ever happened. One afternoon when I was in 3rd grade and Harper was in 1st, she tugged on my backpack and told me someone else had shown up asking for both of us. She said he'd pulled up in a car she didn't recognize, leaned out the window with a smile, and told her our dad had sent him instead. For a moment, she believed him, but she didn't like the way he said her name, so she stepped away to find me before getting anywhere near the door handle. That small decision probably saved us from something terrible. I grabbed my teacher immediately and told her what Harper said. Her expression changed fast. She wasn't panicking, but she wasn't brushing off either. She told us to stay right next to her, and a few minutes later, my dad's actual car rolled up. We explained everything at home that evening, and that turned into a long talk about what to do if anything like that ever happened again. He called the police with what little description we had, though Harper hadn't been focused on things like the man's clothes or the car model. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, the man asked for me specifically. My dad had already warned the school, but the assistants couldn't keep track of every car that rolled through, especially since he appeared in a different vehicle. I remember walking toward a black car that looked just enough like my dad's that I didn't question it right away. I got close enough to see the man's face. I recognized him even before my brain fully caught up. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his expression had this weird tightness that made me freeze. I backed away and turned to tell the staff member beside me. But by the time she looked up, the car was already disappearing down the street. My dad filed another report, but without a plate number or anything concrete. There wasn't much they could do. The last time I saw him was months later, near the end of the school year. A group of us from a neighborhood were walking home together, something we did often since most of our families knew each other. A car rolled slowly past us, and when I glanced over, I saw him behind the wheel. He didn't try to hide it. He leaned just slightly toward the open window, like he wanted me to notice. I shouted for everyone to run, and we bolted into the nearest friend's house. Her parents were startled, but they believed us once we explained why we'd barged in. That was the last time I ever saw that man. My dad met the woman who would become my stepmom soon after, and we moved across town and switched schools. Life shifted in a way that pulled us out of that routine. But sometimes his face still shows up in my dreams. Even now in my 20s, I think about how he knew our names, how he found the right pickup lane, how close Harper came to opening a stranger's car door. It's one of those memories that doesn't fade just because you get older. When all this happened, I was 16, around 6 feet tall, and built heavier than most guys my age because of rugby. Lucas, on the other hand, was much smaller, maybe 5'5", really slim, and genuinely one of the most attractive guys I'd ever seen. We were the same age, share a handful of classes at our school in Minneapolis, and every time I saw him, I felt that mixture of interest and panic that came with being closeted and not wanting anyone to figure out why I kept glancing his way. I figured it was safer to just keep quiet and admire him from a distance rather than risk finding out he wasn't into guys or getting rejected in front of half the school. Toward the middle of the term, I started noticing him watching me during class. At first, it almost felt flattering, like maybe he'd noticed me too. But after a while, it got strange. He'd stare long enough for me to feel it, and I'd pretend I didn't see because I didn't know how to react without making everything awkward. Then fall break happened, and 2 weeks away from school basically wiped him from my mind. When we returned, we ended up sitting next to each other for a project in psychology. At first, we barely talked, but once we had to actually work together, the silence broke. Talking to him that first time made me feel both relieved and extremely aware of how close he was. He was even more attractive up close, and I could barely focus. After a few classes of casual work-related conversations, he surprised me by asking for my number. I asked why, mostly because I couldn't believe he actually wanted it. He just shrugged and said he was curious. I handed it over before I could second-guess myself. That first night, he started texting. Normal questions at first. How I was doing, what I was up to. But what stood out was how fast he replied. I'd take 2 or 3 minutes, and he'd answer in seconds every single time. He didn't have social media, and whenever I saw him at school, he was always alone, reading old books that looked like they'd survived a decade of being tossed around in backpacks. Somehow, that made it feel safer to ask if he was gay, because by then, I really wanted to know what he expected from me. I took a deep breath and sent the question. He took longer to respond than usual, maybe 2 minutes, but eventually replied, "Yes. Does that bother you?" I told him I was too, mostly because I was so relieved I didn't think twice. He answered with a short, "Oh, cool." For a moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. But things shifted after that. He started sending long bursts of messages whenever I took too long to respond. 5, sometimes 10 in a row, asking where I was, whether he'd done something wrong, or if I wanted him to disappear. When I replied, the panic would vanish and he'd act sweet again, like nothing had happened. Winter break came around, and I was ready to go out to parties with friends. I left the house one night, completely forgetting my phone charger wasn't plugged in, so my phone died by the time I got to party. I didn't think about it again until the walk home. After my friends split off, I took a small wooded path I'd used hundreds of times before. It never bothered me, even late at night. Halfway down the trail, I heard whispering from a bush right next to the path. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I kept walking slowly, hoping whoever was wouldn't react. But the whispering stopped all at once, and the leaves started shifting in this slow, deliberate way that made it impossible to pretend someone wasn't hiding there. I froze, convinced that running would somehow make things worse. After a few seconds, a figure slowly stood up from behind the bush. Short, thin, wearing a black hoodie pulled so far forward I couldn't see a face. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just some messed up prank. But then he raised an arm, and I saw a kitchen knife glinting just enough to make out a dark red smear along the blade. I didn't wait for anything else. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was almost home. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the figure was standing in the open part of the path, completely still, just watching me. I burst in my front door and woke my parents. My dad called the police while I kept checking the windows in case someone had followed me. The next morning, the police said they didn't find anything but would look into it. When I finally turned my phone on, it flooded with notifications. More than 200 messages from Lucas. The last few were chilling. He said that if he couldn't have me, no one could. He wrote that he knew my route home and wanted to show me how devoted he was. I showed everything to my parents, and they handed it all to the police. Lucas didn't come back to school. Not the next day, not the next week, not ever. Most people didn't notice because he kept to himself. Every teacher I asked about him shut down instantly, refusing to say anything. Eventually, I stopped asking. Part of me didn't want to know anyway. I'll never know whose blood was on that knife, or if it even was blood. I don't know what he planned or how close I came to something much worse. I'm 20 now, in college, and even though it feels like a lifetime ago, the memory of that night still hits me sometimes when I walk alone.